I would not say that we're on the verge of a new war, but I would agree that US-Russia relations are at their lowest point since the end of the Cold War. And if the sides use arms control in a creative way, taking account of the concerns of the other, they might better be able to manage the relationship and at least put some constraints on the arms competition, that part of the relationship which is adversarial in nature. Well, I would say strategic stability has become a much more complex concept than it was during the Cold War. I mean, during the Cold War and strategic stability, you looked at really two countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, and then Russia, and you really compared their strategic offensive forces. And the question was, could each survive a first strike by the other and still have sufficient survivable strategic forces to devastate the attacker? And if that was the case, you could say the situation was stable. Today, stability has many more factors in play, and you have to bring in other countries. You have to now, for example, consider China and other countries. You have to talk about missile defense and conventional strike and space and cyber. So it's a much more complex question. So I think initially the United States and Russia, American and Russian officials should meet in strategic stability talks to talk about how these factors all interact with one another. I then would like to see a US-Russia negotiation that would talk about limiting and reducing all American and Russian nuclear weapons, strategic, non-strategic, deployed, non-deployed, because I do believe that both countries have more nuclear weapons than their security needs require. Now, in conjunction with that, and this may depend on Russian preferences, there may need to be discussions or even negotiations about other related issues such as missile defense. We'll have to see. I think that will become apparent as the sides begin to engage. You can't depoliticize that. A lot of the differences between the United States and Russia today are political in nature. So you're not going to be able to depoliticize everything. However, I would hope that in Washington and Moscow, there's a recognition that now, again, when the relations are so difficult, when I think the United States and Russia each perceive the other in large part in adversarial terms, arms control, guardrails, constraints on the nuclear arms and related competition make more sense. I mean, it's more important to my mind that we have the New START Treaty today in 2021, when US-Russia relations are far more difficult than they were, say, in 2010 or 2011. And so I hope we can have both sides recognize the importance of those kinds of discussions, so you can have negotiations that look at ways to control the nuclear competition, even if the broader relationship is still going to have difficult aspects. I think one of the complex issues that Russia and the United States will have to work early on, because if you look at what American officials talk about, the primary American interest with Russia is getting into a negotiation that would limit and reduce all American and Russian nuclear weapons. Some of the statements that come from Moscow suggest that the Russian priorities tend to focus more on missile defense or long-range precision-guided conventional strike. And I think one of the early challenges for Washington and Moscow will be to reconcile those different priorities so that they can get the negotiations going without too much delay. Well, let me say I belong to Global Zero. I would like to see all nuclear weapons verifiably eliminated. And here's my reason. I look back over the Cold War and believe nuclear deterrence between the United States and the Soviet Union probably kept the United States and the Soviet Union from going to war. When you look at the tensions that you saw, particularly in the 50s and the 60s. But also, if you look back over the Cold War, you're going to see, maybe 5 to 10 cases where nuclear deterrence almost broke down. The Cuban Missile Crisis, technical failures both in American and Soviet computers. And the breakdown of nuclear deterrence could have been catastrophic. It could have been measured in terms of tens, if not hundreds of millions of dead Americans and Russians. So the question in my mind is, as long as we choose to live with nuclear deterrence and nuclear weapons, we have to live with that probability, and it's a very small probability, but that small probability that deterrence will fail and there could be a nuclear catastrophe. That's why I would prefer to get to a non-nuclear world, because I think we could eliminate that risk. So I think it's a goal, let me make sure it's a goal. If it's a verifiable, you have to have confidence that everybody's gotten rid of the nuclear weapons, and you have to have confidence that the nuclear capability could not be quickly restored without being detected. But having said that, I think it's probably difficult to get to that kind of world. It's going to take a lot of work. And part of it is different perceptions. From my perspective as an American, a world without nuclear weapons looks like a pretty good world. It eliminates that nuclear risk of which I just spoke. And from the American perspective, we have favorable geography. We have the protection afforded by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. We have friendly neighbors in Canada and Mexico. We have powerful conventional military forces, and we have the world's strongest system of allies. So from my perspective, a non-nuclear world looks pretty good. My guess is that somebody in Russia looking at this might come to a different conclusion because of different geographical circumstances, Russia between China and NATO, things like that. So while I think a world without nuclear weapons is a desirable goal, it's hard for me to see, or it's going to be difficult to see us actually achieving that. So what I would argue for is that we ought to be moving in a step-by-step process towards reducing the nuclear threat, reducing nuclear weapons numbers, heading in that direction of global zero, even if it may be hard or it's someday impossible to achieve it. I certainly believe that the space and cyber domains should be a subject for discussion in US-Russian strategic stability talks, and hopefully at some point even in US-Chinese strategic stability talks, and perhaps even for negotiation. I mean, if you look at outer space, both the American and Russian militaries have some important assets in outer space that are important for strategic stability. Early warning systems, that would give each country quick notice of a launch by the other side of a ballistic missile. They have their command and control systems for nuclear weapons in space. Those are important. And to the extent now that there are, for example, land-based anti-satellite capabilities or other weapons that could threaten those assets in space, I think that is potentially destabilizing. So certainly that should be a discussion in the strategic stability talks. Likewise, on cyber, it's difficult to imagine anything that could be more destabilizing than if a nuclear weapon state could hack into and disrupt the other side's computer systems that provide command and control of its nuclear weapons, either to prevent the launch or to launch without authorization or just to disrupt it. The problem is, and this may just reflect my own lack of knowledge about cyber questions, it's not apparent to me that the traditional arms control tools can address the sorts of challenges that we see that cyber might pose for strategic stability. So I think right now, my recommendation is, sides need to be doing everything that they can to ensure the resilience and the security of their nuclear and command and control systems, in part because they may not know if they've been hacked into. I think today when you're talking about threats, the one existential threat to the United States, other than climate change and natural questions, is the Russian nuclear arsenal. I mean, the Russians have the capability to destroy the United States as a functioning society. I don't think China yet has quite that capability. Now, having said that, looking out over the next 3 to 5 decades, or the next 1 to 5 decades, I think China, because of the combination of a dynamic economy, not just its nuclear weapons, but more so its conventional arms buildup, China poses the bigger strategic challenge for the United States. So we have to deal with both Russia and China, for slightly different reasons. Now, in the case of China, I think it would be useful to have an American-Chinese dialogue on strategic stability. It's going to be, I think, hard to get the Chinese to negotiate on nuclear weapons. The Trump administration tried and they failed. And that should not have been a surprise. I mean, a trilateral negotiation between the United States, Russia, and China on nuclear weapons was not going to work, because today Russia has about 4,500 total nuclear weapons. The United States number is about 3,800, and China's down at about 300. Washington and Moscow would not be prepared to reduce to China's level, and they would not be prepared to tell the Chinese, yes, you can build up to our level. And China's not going to accept unequal limits. So I just think that concept of a trilateral negotiation was flawed from the beginning. You know, my own way to approach this was, if you could get another US-Russia negotiation that successfully negotiated an agreement covering all of their nuclear weapons and actually begin to reduce those weapons further, then the United States could perhaps go to China and the Russians as well. And my guess is the Russians would want to involve Britain and France, but ask London, Paris, and Beijing not to build up as long as the United States and Russia were coming down. And then perhaps asking those other three countries, Britain, France, and China, to accept some kind of transparency measures that would provide some confidence that they were not building up. And that might be a way at least to arrest a buildup while the United States and Russia were coming down. Now, there may be other categories of weapons where, for example, intermediate range missiles or space, where China is a peer competitor with Russia and Russia and the United States. And in fact, in intermediate weapons and missiles, China has far more than Russia or the United States. So there may be some other areas where some negotiations may make more sense because there's a greater balance among the sides. But for the foreseeable future, I don't see a trilateral negotiation on nuclear weapons as possible. I think restoring the Treaty on Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces is going to be very, very difficult, in part because there is still lingering unhappiness in Washington that Russia chose to violate that treaty by developing and deploying the 9M729 cruise missile, which is of intermediate range. And in the meantime, what you've had is the US military has decided, primarily given its requirements in Asia, that it would be useful for the United States to have a land-based intermediate range missile as a counterbalance to the large number of Chinese conventionally armed intermediate range missiles. So it seems to me that it would be very hard to restore the INF Treaty and to bring China in. I mean, China, again, with hundreds of these missiles, where Russia has only a handful and the United States at this point has none, it's a hard time seeing how that negotiation would work. Now, there might be a couple of possibilities that would be a bit more limited. One could you have a negotiation between Washington and Moscow, and perhaps including Beijing, where the sides would agree to ban nuclear-armed intermediate range missiles. The American interest and the United States has said that the intermediate range missiles it's developing will be conventionally armed only. China has the bulk of its intermediate range missiles are conventionally armed. And although Russia's 9M729 is dual capable, my own belief is that the Russian military desires that mostly for its conventional strike capabilities. So could you come up with an agreement that would ban nuclear-armed intermediate range missiles? That would pose some verification challenges, but I think they would not be insoluble. A second thing that the sides might look at, and I know that the United States and NATO rejected the Russian proposal for a moratorium on the deployment of intermediate range missiles in Europe. That might be worth a second look, provided that there are two things, provided that it does indeed include the 9M729. That means any 9M729 missiles now in the European part of Russia would be either eliminated or withdrawn to Asia. And second, that there were in fact good verification measures. So there's some possibilities, but I don't see us being at a point where we could resurrect the INF Treaty. Well, I hope that we find a way to persuade Iran not to proceed down the course of developing nuclear weapons. And at least my own view is I accept the judgment of the American intelligence community, which appears to be that Iran does not want to be a nuclear weapon state, but it wants to have the potential. It wants to have the ability, should it make that decision to acquire nuclear weapons, to be able to do so within a couple of years. But I do worry that if Iran were to be moving directly for a nuclear weapon, what would be the consequences? What would the Saudis do? I mean, there has been talk that the Saudis would regard a situation in which Iran had a nuclear weapon as unacceptable, and they might try to acquire their own nuclear capability. It seems to me that an Iran with a nuclear capability is going to further destabilize the Middle East and would have very negative implications for potential proliferation of nuclear weapons in that region. So I very much hope that agreement can be reached. I know the sides are working on this in Vienna to restore restore American participation in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That at least puts significant constraints on the Iranian nuclear program for a number of years. It seems to me that both the United States and Iran have indicated that they want to get back into the agreement. The question now is basically working out the terms of bringing the United States back in and then restoring Iranian compliance with the terms of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So I hope as a first step that the United States can rejoin the agreement, and that Iran will then basically come back into full compliance with the agreement. But then I think there will be questions for a further discussion are there steps that could build on the JCPOA to ensure that the nuclear issue remains contained in the Middle East for longer than just the terms of the JCPOA. It may be that you don't have in Washington or Moscow or Beijing or London or Paris people who went through the very dramatic and worrisome crises of the Cold War. I mean, my guess is, and I think history has shown, that the Cuban Missile Crisis had a big impact both on Washington and Moscow. And it was, I think, coming that close to a potential nuclear conflict that probably gave a boost that led at the later part of the 1960s towards the United States and the Soviet Union beginning exploratory discussions that ultimately led to the strategic arms limitation talks. And sometimes I look at comments, and I'll have to single out Vladimir Putin. Some of the comments that he sometimes makes about nuclear weapons lead me to be a bit concerned that he may not fully understand the consequences of a nuclear conflict. Now, having said that, let me also say that I think there's a little bit of a paradox here, is that during the Cold War, there was a small fear of a catastrophic nuclear clash between the United States and the Soviet Union that could have been civilization ending for both countries. Today, I think the concern is a lot less about that kind of conflict, but it may be that there are greater possibilities of nuclear conflict because you have more nuclear players. India, Pakistan, for example, they didn't have nuclear weapons during the Cold War. They now have nuclear weapons. Those countries also have a history of several conflicts over the past 5 decades. Is that relationship going to remain stable and keep nuclear weapons out of use? So I'm not sure I'd say the fear is diminished, but the fear maybe has changed. Is my concern is that while we may have less of a chance of the kind of nuclear exchange that was of such great concern during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, we may be in a situation where the use of nuclear weapons at a smaller scale now is more likely than it was during the Cold War. And that's why, in parallel with working on things like US and Russian nuclear weapons reductions and trying to bring the Chinese and the British and the French into that process, we've also got to be looking at ways to deal with the tensions, for example, between India and Pakistan. How do you deal with North Korea and those sorts of issues? It's got to be in parallel with, I'd argue, a focus on the two major nuclear powers, and the United States and Russia between them control well over 90% of the nuclear weapons in the world. So they have a special responsibility to reduce. But we've also got to look more broadly, perhaps even at multilateral instruments that would address the nuclear weapons and the nuclear potential of other countries. My optimism is, I think, at some level, both sides understand just how catastrophic a nuclear conflict could be. it may not be with as fine of appreciation as you had, for example, in the 1960s and the 1970s. And as I said, I do worry sometimes about what I would regard as fairly loose talk about nuclear weapons that we hear from Mr. Putin. But I think if the sides in the United States and Russia truly are, to restore a serious nuclear arms negotiation, and bear in mind, we have not had that negotiation for a decade now, since the New START Treaty was negotiated in 2010. That's actually the longest period between Washington and Moscow since 1969, when you've not have some kind of nuclear arms negotiations going on. So I'd like to see that restored, and the sides look at both nuclear weapons, but also in stability talks look at related questions, which may in fact require some negotiations when you talk about issues like missile defense or conventional strike, but begin to look at ways that we can better contain the nuclear competition. Look at ways on both sides to build more time into nuclear decision-making. I think it should concern people that in some scenarios, an American president or a Russian president could have only 15 minutes to make, or even less, 10 or 15 minutes to make one of the most consequential decisions any leader in history would ever have to make. So are there things that can be done to extend that decision time, to give an opportunity for more reflection and for calmer thinking about questions regarding nuclear use? And then, more broadly, we've got to get at some of the underlying issues. I mean, countries have nuclear weapons as a result of security concerns. How do you begin to address some of these security concerns? And that's going to require tackling, some big problems. So, for example, on the American-Russian agenda, a really big issue is Russia's conflict against Ukraine. Are there things that can happen that can resolve that, which then might open a path to moving the US-Russia relationship to a better place? So there's a lot of work to be done on a lot of different levels if we want to basically move the situation away from one now where we have to be a bit concerned that nuclear weapons and their possible use is a real possibility, a small possibility. But quite frankly, the smaller that possibility, and we could ever get that possibility to zero, the better we all would be, better off we'd all be.